Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on interviewing techniques. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I'm your instructor for this course. This week, we will be exploring one of the most powerful ways to build trust and rapport with clients, what we call client-centered engagement. Now, client-centered engagement is more than being polite or friendly. It is a mindset and method that prioritizes the client's autonomy, prioritizes the client's experience, and the client's readiness to change. So in addictions counseling, where many clients feel unheard or disrespected, and maybe they have high levels of defensiveness, maybe sometimes they feel coerced, a client-centered approach can really mean the difference between resistance and relationship. And of course, we all know that an authentic relationship with the counselor is what is the transforming power within the relationship. So, as always, I like to start off just kind of letting you know what we're going to be covering in this class. So, as always, I start off with a little story, and then we have three main themes that I'd like to cover in today's lecture. The first one is looking a little bit at the philosophy behind client-centered engagement. Now, of course, we've already talked about Carl Rogers and his whole philosophy of person-centered engagement. And so client-centered engagement obviously is going to draw from that quite significantly. And then we move on to techniques to promote autonomy and collaboration. Autonomy is, of course, a central ethical goal of counseling. And so we want to respect the client's autonomy. At the same time, we want to help the client to transform and to reach the goals in the way that they want. And the reason they're in the relationship with you is that collaboration. So how do we promote both autonomy and collaboration within that counseling relationship? And then finally, recognizing and responding to resistance as feedback. Sometimes clients will resist, and we need to find ways of, first off, identifying that, but also how can we respond so that this continues to support the relationship and is not something that is combative or argumentative. So that's what we'll be covering today: the philosophy behind client-centered engagement, techniques to promote autonomy and collaboration, and recognizing and responding to resistance as feedback. Now, when we talk about the story, I already mentioned Carl Rogers, but there's somebody else that's very important in client-centered and person-centered theory, and that is Carl Rogers' daughter, Natalie Rogers, who was born in 1928 and died in 2015. She went on to carry on her father's legacy and extended person-centered therapy into expressive arts therapy. Like her father, she championed the belief that individuals possess an innate capacity for healing if provided with the right conditions. When provided with a context of empathy, the client has an innate capacity to heal. When provided with the condition of authenticity, the client has an innate capacity for healing. And when shown unconditional positive regard, that seems to unleash that innate capacity. So her work really underscored the importance of the creative side of engagement and the relational engagement. and really help to broaden the definition of what client-centered counseling includes. It's not just techniques, it includes the nonverbal, the creative, and the experiential forms of connection as well. So, if you ever want to explore this kind of approach and do it in an expressive arts therapy way, then Natalie Rogers is the person to dive into and explore a little bit more about her thinking on this area. So, what is client-centered engagement? Well, we can kind of think of client-centered engagement as a means for viewing the client as the expert of their own life. We are simply the person that comes alongside. We might have the training, but when it comes to their life, they are the expert. Rather than giving directives or making judgments, the counselor in this kind of situation creates a space where the client feels heard, where they feel respected and empowered. And so this is really a stance that avoids power struggles and really invites collaboration. So it's at its heart honoring that autonomy and is built upon collaboration. So, how do we build collaborative relationships? Well, collaboration really begins with asking permission, inviting input, and emphasizing shared decision-making processes. So there's some examples. Things like, would it be okay if we explore that more deeply? That would be an example of asking permission. Or, what direction would feel most helpful for you today? That is giving the client the autonomy. Or, how does that idea sit with you? Finding out the values of the client. And when clients are included in this process, they are much more likely to engage. And engagement is key in the transformation process, in the healing process. The client cannot be passive in the healing process. They must engage. So, doing things that encourage that collaborative relationship are absolutely central. And within this, we need to remember that we need to support autonomy. So autonomy is not an option. It is fundamental to the transformation process. Even when clients may make risky decisions or painful choices, respecting their freedom is key, because in the end, it comes down to the choices that they make. So there are ways to support autonomy. First off, we can affirm the client's strengths and values. We can acknowledge the client's control over decisions. And we can avoid ultimatums or coercion. And this shows that change is something clients choose, not something that's done to them. Now, we need to recognize resistance as communication. When resistance comes, we need to understand that it is the client's way of telling us something. It's not necessarily defiance. They're telling us, they're giving us a signal. It may be a reflection of fear. It may be a reflection of past trauma. Or sometimes it's a signal that there are unclear goals in the mind of the client. So instead of confronting resistance, take the time to explore that resistance. Here's some examples. It sounds like part of you is unsure about this step. And then just invite them to share about that unsure feeling. Or, what concerns you about moving forward right now? and explore that. Responding with some curiosity to this resistance really invites the client to reflect instead of retreating. Retreating and defensiveness are typically the knee-jerk reactions of someone that's struggling with addiction. So the more that you can respond with curiosity and simply reflect and invite the client to reflect rather than retreat, the better off you will be. Not only does it transform their automatic thinking patterns, but it helps them to recognize that there are other alternatives. And remember that language strengthens the engagement when you use language properly. And we strengthen the engagement by choosing words that invite collaboration. Things like, how would you like to approach this? Or, what's important to you in this decision? Or, can I offer a thought, or would you prefer to keep processing for now? And all of this gives the client ownership over the conversation. And the more ownership the client can have, the better off that the relationship will be. The huge part of this, remember, is helping the client to discover their own thinking and choices. So by creating a safe environment where the client can practice their autonomy and risk-taking, then we can move through the process much more easily. So when clients feel safe, they're going to start to take some emotional risks. And this might mean sharing painful memories, or admitting to relapses, or expressing fear. And the counselor's role is to stay steady, to stay warm, and to stay open, especially when the client struggles. And remember, engagement is tested not when things go well, but when things go hard. And that is an important thing to be mindful of. So here's an example of client engagement. The client might say something like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And in that kind of context, the counselor might say something like, part of you feels like giving up. That's honest. And yet you're still here talking about it. So what keeps you connected to this work? And this response really kind of acknowledges the client's pain while gently reconnecting them to their own motivation. And that can be key. Remember, finding that ambivalence is good. Ambivalence is fine. But then help connect it to the motivation that the client does have. So that's a little bit for our lecture for today. And for this week, I'd like to kind of highlight 3 key terms moving forward here. The first one is client-centered. What do we mean by client-centered? Well, that is a counseling stance that prioritizes the client's autonomy and perspective. Then there's collaboration. What's collaboration? Well, that's when we have shared decision-making and mutual respect in that counseling relationship. And finally, resistance. And that's where the client behavior may indicate fear or confusion or defensiveness or a mismatch in pacing. And identifying that can be a helpful way of reconnecting the client to their motivation. And then finally, our quiz question. What is a good one of the best supports for client-centered engagement. And of those options, I would say C. What kind of support would feel helpful right now? Okay, you're asking for the client to choose that. So as we close out our lecture this week, I just want to remind you that client-centered engagement is the foundation of all effective counseling. It's what makes people feel safe enough to tell the truth, to feel safe enough to take risks, and to feel safe enough to imagine that they indeed can change. So this week, as you are talking with people, I want you to practice listening to other people's needs, not just to what you want to give. Ask more than you advise. Invite more than you instruct. Evoke more than you say. And in so doing, you'll create a relationship that becomes the vehicle for healing within the counseling relationship. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.